Okay, so what I want to do with this video is, as a part of my effort to make my ideas around human development and life more broadly accessible to people, I thought that I would apply them to acting, because if you've been following my work, you'll know that I some time ago changed the letter of poetry to the letter of poesis, because I think poesis, which means a kind of creativity, is a more accurate term for the broader sequence of development that I'm charting. So the reason why I started with poetry is not just because it's what I know best and I've sort of moved through and absorbed a lot of that field, but also because poets are, I think, the most articulate of people. So they articulate more than other artists the theory behind their approach, which is what is called poetics. And so it gives us a really clear window into the different stages of development and how each of these different stages has a different approach. So let's get into acting, because most people are more familiar with acting. And so I'm going to draw on some examples that I think are going to be quite straightforward. So again, if you've been following my ideas, you know there are 4 stages of development. And the lower half is the exoteric half. The top half is the esoteric. So we start in the exoteric development at the sentimental stage. We build on that to the scholar stage of development. You'll also remember, possibly, that in the scholar category, there are 2 ways that can express. The iconoclast, where there's a really strong sense of self, but there's definitely a use of traditional craft techniques. It's not just sentimental self-expression. And then, whereas the scholar proper in poetry is all about basically self-abnegation, and not expressing subjectivity, but expressing something through crafting an artifact in poetry, focusing on form, and not having any trace of the personality in it, as T.S. Eliot said. So I think this maps. So exoteric development. Exoteric really just means development that is there already out in the world. It's been assimilated. People are aware of it. It's familiar and it's uncontested at this point because it's just already been assimilated. Esoteric is something different, and it's controversial and it's contested, and people are fighting it tooth and nail. They don't even think it exists. So the strongest, shall we say, proof of what I'm talking about is to see how there's a logic to the unfoldment in these lower stages, which people already acknowledge exists. They just aren't quite using the language that I'm using. And I think my language is more accessible. And so let's get into it. So everyone knows about and has commented at length on the distinction between a character actor who loses themselves in the role and the leading actor who basically plays the same role every time in every movie they're in. A really old classic example is John Wayne. A more modern example would be Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who plays the same thing every time. And then, of course, you get the iconoclasts that is the iconoclasts. And then you get the character actors who are all about the method approach to acting, where the aim is, through craft, to lose oneself in the role so that there's no subjectivity in it. That's when a person basically becomes another person. That's what it looks like. They're not themselves playing a role. That's what a leading actor does. They are another person for that time, for that movie. And we are drawn to both types. We pay collectively, obviously, sometimes $1 billion to actors who can just play themselves. But we also are amazed by those who can lose themselves in the role. And we think there's some kind of magic being done here. This is the same level of development, and it's the same deep structural pattern that we see in poetry, right? So a poet like T.S. Eliot is always talking about, in The Wasteland, for instance, that's a good example of it. He's always talking about trying to remove himself from the equation, the creative equation, so that the objective correlate emerges, so that there's no subjectivity in it. But we also love poets like, I'm thinking Charles Bukowski is probably the most straightforward example, potentially Ted Hughes as well, Sylvia Plath, poets that Walt Whitman, Lord Byron, poets that we kind of read them because they're celebrities, right? I mean, that's a really good shorthand way of thinking about it. So another way of putting that is we read them because we want to get a touch of their divinely infused self. I mean, that's what charisma means. It's what celebrity also means, to be a star. You're connected to the divine somehow. You've been touched and blessed by the divine. Now, that's exoteric stage of development. People who are well versed in poetry and poetry criticism know that that's uncontested. We've already assimilated that distinction in poetry. We've done it even more so, in a sense, with cinema and acting. It's a really, really obvious distinction, and that's what I'm trying to point out. This, when we get into the esoteric stuff, naturally, because it's esoteric, it hasn't been assimilated yet, it's a lot subtler, and I think there may be some kind of reluctance to follow the thinking of this whole project into those spaces, because it's subtler and there aren't as many known examples of it. But if we can just get our head around properly the exoteric stages of development, because they're right there, they're easy to grasp, they're concrete. I'm not actually adding anything new in the exoteric stages of development. That's all been thought out and accepted by millions of people. So those are sort of the iconoclast and the scholar stages. Now we can sort of move on to the sentimental stage, which is one beneath them, which I just think is pretty straightforward. That's your soap opera actors, it's your amateur actors who have still kind of confused acting with just like a chance to express their feelings and basically emote that they haven't refined and purified. That's actually the alchemical term of the because in my original lectures where I lay out the architecture of this, I apply the alchemical lens, and at the scholar stage we get purification, because whereas there's a purging at the lowest stage, the sentimental. So their craft hasn't yet been purified into a craft, right? That's what we get at the sentimental stage. Now we can move on to esoteric development in acting. So if we get our head around the fact that implicit, now again, I'm not adding anything here, I'm just trying to show you what you already know and accept. Implicit in the sentimental stage is, we've all accepted this, that we have subjectivity that's being purged, expressed at the sentimental stage. We also know that there's an objectivity, which is when a great actor can lose themselves in the role and it becomes another person. That's objectivity, because it's not the subjectivity of the actor's personality anymore. It's something else. So we actually know that there are two poles, subjectivity and objectivity. Again, this is not new information. I'm just articulating it explicitly. What we get at esoteric development is basically a fusion of those two. So there's enough subjective depth, there's enough objective skill with craft, that it kind of fuses into one thing through which something transjective, which is what, as you can see, now we're getting into contested territory. What someone like Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, he referred to archetypes as transjective. So they show up in our subjectivity, but they also show up in the world around us. They're objective. They form patterns both within psyche and without psyche. And so that then it starts to actually, it's almost like it pulls these archetypes, pull the self, pull the two poles together so that it can flow, this larger thing, which an archetype is, can flow through our vehicles into form and be created. So if you can accept, and you already do, that we have a subjective pole and an objective pole, I'm not saying that makes it easier for you to accept the possibility of some kind of a harmonization between them. But I'm just saying that it at least will get your head around what I'm even trying to theoretically propose. Like, if you can see it as a proposal that kind of hangs together, that's better to me than, even if you don't accept it, it's better to me than if you were to not accept it and not even understand what I'm saying. Okay. So the difficulty is, and this is what I talk about in my last lecture, I talk about all the 6 ways that divinity gets reductively confused. And there's a few ways that scholars kind of mess things up, and people are always eager to say, if someone's more spiritual or distinct, they're at the sensing stage. And I, in my last lecture, really spoke about how it's actually quite rare to be at the sensing stage. A lot goes into the development of a person like that, because they're basically an occultist, which is just another way of saying that someone like Faust in Goethe's Faust, or Ralph Waldo Emerson, the transcendentalist, and Nietzsche was very close. He was on the cusp of it. These are quite, I would say, highly developed people, and they are quite austere, they're quite lofty, they're not interested in the they don't have the same vices, let's say, that most people have. So it is hard to get to that stage, and it's very conscious. They've made divinity conscious, basically. That's again. So they're doing something that exoteric culture doesn't even think possible. It doesn't. It's not even a hypothesis yet, because they haven't even sensed enough to develop the ability to cognize it, even hypothetically. And so for that reason, I'm leaning towards saying Daniel Day-Lewis actually, and I wouldn't even say I'm leaning, I don't think he is at the sensing stage. I would say he's the best actor out there based on the movies I've seen. But I would still put him at the form-based divinity. If you recall my little diagram in the last lecture, that's one of the, I think it's like it's one of the, it's higher than the scholar proper. But it's still a reduction of divinity. It's not yet able to like work with it intelligently and consciously. It's more like, and if you recall from the lecture, I say that these people, an analogy in poetry would be Geoffrey Hill, Owen Barfield. They have the force of erudition, right? They seem more divine to us than your typical scholar, in the same way that Daniel Day-Lewis seems more divine to us than your average method actor, right? Say a Christian Bale, who's still fantastic at what he does. And why is that? Because there's a little bit more divinity in the frame. It's not just about craft with Daniel Day-Lewis. He is open to something else, right? But it's still very anchored to form. It's anchored to... it's somehow reduced, kind of frozen a little bit. It's more like it's more porous. Is probably the best way of putting it. But porous is not the same thing as, again, intelligently working with essence. So it's interesting because, and there's also a kind of a certain vacuity I've noticed in Daniel Day-Lewis, but in actors in general. They don't have a lot of their own thoughts. And I suspect that, that has to be a part of the disposition that draws one to acting and makes one good at it. But I suspect that a truly esoteric actor would have to be actually intelligent, and be able to do what they do consciously. Daniel Day-Lewis is like open to the imagination. He's laying the conditions for it. That's his quote, which is good, and I think that's a necessary approach. But again, I think that still implies a kind of distance to essence. It's not yet conscious. I don't know what that would actually look like in practice and how we would distinguish that from Daniel Day-Lewis's acting, who is sort of acknowledged as the best ever to do it. how can we conceive of a better actor? I don't know, because potentially that actor they haven't yet emerged. It's a bit like asking, how does a Shakespeare? How do you get better than him? But that's my read of it, and so I think possibly going forward, I'm not going to make any strict plans, just to keep the door open, if it aligns with my schedule and everything like that. There's we could just start applying this to a few different fields of art, and maybe bring in a few people to talk about this kind of thing. Regardless, I hope you've found this a bit of an accessible window into the ideas of the ladder of Poesis. Thank you for listening.